Well, I left off with David's chilling propaganda piece, The Death of Murat. And it is a propaganda piece. So the note that the dead Murat is clutching is not the note that Charlotte Corday sent to gain an audience. It is a letter to a poor widow offering Murat's help, and it's a letter that David fabricated completely to win more sympathy from Murat. Murat's skin disease is gone. Moreover, David has deliberately borrowed Christian imagery to convey martyrdom. So the resemblance to Michelangelo's Pietà is no accident. Here's another of David's French Revolution paintings. This one was submitted to the French Academy after the National Assembly had met and called for a new constitution, and after the Bastille had fallen, but before the king was arrested and executed. So this painting depicts Brutus, a Roman leader, grieving for his sons, whom he himself ordered executed. Again, David's classically educated viewers would have known this story well. Brutus's sons had attempted to overthrow the government and restore the monarchy, so the father ordered their death to maintain the republic. So Brutus was the heroic defender of the republic at the cost of his own family. The message was pretty clear. All must be sacrificed to the revolution, even ones near and dear. Let's hear another short commentary from Simon Schama. Well, when the head-chopping phase of the revolution, what we usually refer to as the Terror, came to an end with the execution of its leader, Robespierre, David came very close to making the personal acquaintance of Madame Guillotine himself. After this near brush with death and a short period of exile, he transferred his loyalties to France's new demagogue, Napoleon. And once again, he took up his paintbrush in the service of propaganda. Your textbook notes that David made several changes to this painting at Napoleon's specific request, including painting the Pope with his hand raised in blessing, which is apparently historically dubious. Originally, David had painted the Pope with his hands in his lap. The Pope was not a particularly willing participant in the coronation of Napoleon. And let's hear one more time from Simon Schama about David's career as Napoleon's chief artist. You've already seen this. This is Napoleon's neoclassical Temple of Honor, now a church. I just wanted to include it again while we're considering the Napoleonic era. And here is Napoleon's favorite sculptor, Antonio Canova. Canova worked in the neoclassical style, but with more of a bow toward naturalism, and maybe in this case eroticism. Napoleon's sister, by the way, was notorious for her many affairs. And so her husband kept this statue secreted away in his own home, and he let only a few select people see it, and then only by torchlight. A little detail from your textbook that I liked. So here's another propaganda piece by another of Napoleon's favorite artists. Now, Gros painted Napoleon visiting plague-stricken soldiers in the Near East during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, and he portrays Napoleon as brave and really in many ways as Christ-like. So note that Napoleon is touching one of the soldiers' sores. Now, the artist painted this after Napoleon became an emperor, so long after the Egyptian campaign. And probably one of the reasons he remained one of Napoleon's favorite artists, he left out an inconvenient detail. Napoleon had actually ordered the infected soldiers poisoned so that he would be spared the danger and bother of transporting them home. A few of them did survive and came home to tell the tale. You know, at first glance, this looks a lot like a painting by David. So we see the heroic figures, the classic architectural details, although I would note that this painting has somewhat more spatial depth. David's paintings have a kind of flat quality. Again, he was very influenced by friezes. But a closer look reveals that we are entering a new art historical period, Romanticism, and that's what's going to occupy us for this and the following lecture, very important period in art history. So we see touches of what is called Orientalism or Orientalisme in French, a fascination with the Near East. And by the way, don't be misled. The term almost always applies to a fascination with North Africa and the Near East, not the Far East, China, Japan, etc. But it's very characteristic of the Romantic era, partly because there was more contact with that part of the world during this time. You see a strong chiaroscuro. That's typical not just of Baroque, but also of Romanticism. There was less of that, more sort of straightforward lighting in the neoclassical painting. Another romantic element, and we're going to see more of that in the coming slides, is that romantic painters often documented current as opposed to historical events or even mythological events. An awful lot of the neoclassical painting was, in fact, it might have very contemporary political meaning. As we saw, David was really painting about the French Revolution, but at least until he was painting for Napoleon, he tended to use classical history to make the current political points he wanted to make. By the way, this would be a great painting to use if the College Board asked you to talk about art as propaganda, and so would most of the paintings by David. Okay, one of these summary slides. I've talked many times about the tendency of new artistic generations to rebel against the older generation. In this case, the complaint is, Mom and Dad, you are just too reasonable. All that emphasis on pure reason struck many artists as cold and unfeeling, especially after they had lived through the cataclysmic events of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and all their concomitant human suffering. So the call for liberty, equality, and fraternity likewise had ignited a passion for freedom, which many Romantic poets and artists interpreted as freedom from society's rules, as well as freedom from political tyranny. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, there was already a strong Romantic thread in Enlightenment thinking, represented by Rousseau. Now, up until now, this emphasis on feeling and freedom had shown up mostly, in art terms that is, in naturalistic landscapes or sentimental paintings of simple peasant families. But now painters began to explore what you might consider the scarier underbelly of emotion, nightmares, insanity, the macabre, beauty that was more unearthly than real and maybe a little scary itself. And all of this is summed up in the term, a little bit confusing, sublime. Sublime doesn't just mean beautiful and calm. It often is associated with terror. Nature to the Romantics was not merely a source of beauty. It was a source of terror, an allegory for the bestiality that humans visited on one another. And again, remember the era and what they've just been through. We also in Romantic art see a return to Baroque-style theatricality, including, as I mentioned, Baroque-style lighting. So you may be surprised I just showed you a summary slide because I usually save those for last. But I started off with a summary of Romanticism because I actually want to backtrack and look at an artist whose career mirrored the move from aristocratic Rococo to Enlightenment rationalism to Romantic sublime and horror. And that artist is Francisco Goya. You've probably figured out that I am not crazy about David. I find his paintings brilliant, but cold and more than a little fanatical. My opinion doesn't matter, but you might as well be aware of my prejudices. And in that spirit, I should warn you that I really, really like Goya. So he started out as a court painter. This painting is one of many designs he did for the royal tapestry work. So basically it's a cartoon that would then be stitched into tapestry. Aside from the Spanish mantillas, this could be a work by Watteau. As it turns out, Goya's designs were a little too complicated for tapestries, really not that well suited to them, but they did catch the eye of the Spanish royal family, and he became a court painter not only to Charles III, but to his much less admirable successor, Charles IV. And this is Goya's famous portrait of the Spanish royal family. Again, Charles IV, his very bossy wife, who, along with their lover, was pretty much the real ruler in Spain, and their many children. In a moment, I'm going to flash Velázquez's famous painting, Las Meninas. The two paintings are simply too big to put on a single slide. The question I want you to think about is how are these superficially very similar paintings, and that similarity is quite deliberate, how are they also different? So here's Las Meninas. Remember my prediction that it's going to show up on the AP exam. You need to tell me if I was right. So note that Velázquez, you see him there on the left, paints himself in the light and gives himself a pretty prominent role in the painting. Goya, I've circled his face there, by contrast, sticks himself into the painting, yes, but in the shadows, almost as if he's hiding. Maybe he was right to hide, because Goya really barely bothers to disguise his disdain for his royal subjects. We know from Goya's writings that he found this Spanish royal family self-indulgent, irresponsible, illiberal, unprepared to meet the challenge that the French Revolution and then Napoleon's invasion would pose to Spain. In fact, like many romantics, Goya initially welcomed the French Revolution, but not when the revolutionaries were succeeded by Napoleon and invaded Spain. I would note, by the way, that there are also important similarities between Velázquez's and Goya's royal portraits in theme and composition, and, for example, Goya's exquisite rendering of the royal family's clothing harks back to Velázquez's style, including those very loose brushstrokes. And that's a style that many romantic artists would imitate as well. Okay. Are these Enlightenment works or are they Romantic works? They're both, which makes this series of aqua tint etchings. That's a particular kind of etching. I'm not going to take the time to describe the complicated process, although I did look it up. At any rate, these are a very important transitional work, and the etching on the right shows up all the time in the AP exam, so consider yourselves warned. Although these date from a couple of years before the painting we just saw of the royal family, Goya's famous series actually marks a serious departure for the artist, and it shows his awareness of and indeed his agreement with the social and political changes that were sweeping across Europe. He wrote his own newspaper advertisement for the prince, and this is what he said. The subjects are chosen, quote, from the multitude of follies and blunders common in every civil society, as well as the vulgar prejudices and lies authorized by custom, ignorance, or interest, those that he has thought most suitable matter for ridicule. Well, not surprisingly, the works were pretty promptly condemned. And in fact, Goya withdrew them. He later claimed that he feared that he would be prosecuted by the Spanish Inquisition. And many of his attacks were on the established Catholic Church. This was also, of course, a favorite target of the French romantics such as Voltaire. So the etching on the right is the one you really need to know. Now, it seems to suggest that when reason sleeps, all sorts of terrible things emerge. So you'd think it's a tribute to pure rationalism, right? Well, Goya wrote a caption for this print that complicates the message. And the caption reads, quote, imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and source of their wonders. In other words, Goya believed that imagination should never be completely renounced in favor of the strictly rational, that they belong together. For Goya, art is the child that reason produces when it gets into bed with imagination. And then came Napoleon's invasion of Spain. The supposed standard bearers of the Enlightenment themselves became violent tyrants, and nightmares became a daily reality in Spain. So now we're going to hear the story behind this painting. By the way, the first painting you will see, the 2nd of May, was also painted by Goya, and the etchings you will see come from a series called The Disasters of War. I did not include any of these in the slideshow. I probably should have, but you need to know that such a series existed, hint, hint. Well, in his old age, deaf and ill, Goya's vision became increasingly grim and macabre. Holed up in his farmhouse outside Madrid, Goya painted a series of murals on the farmhouse walls, which came to be known as his black paintings. The most famous of these is Saturn devouring his children. I hope you watched the Khan Academy podcast on that. This is ostensibly just a very graphic illustration of a classical creation myth. Saturn, or Kronos in Greek, had received a prophecy that one of his children would kill him, so he devoured them as they were born. But his wife, Rhea, managed to save one of the sons, Jupiter. Basically, he fed a stone. She fed a stone to Jupiter. And in fact, Jupiter grew up to kill his father, forced him to vomit up all of his siblings, who go on to become the Greco-Roman pantheon. But surely the real subject of this painting is how the revolution devours its own children. Goya, by the way, painted these dark visions entirely for himself. They were never offered for sale or even public exhibition. Again, they were just painted on the walls of his farmhouse. Do you remember Goya's rendering of Judith as a bloodthirsty revolutionary woman? This, too, was one of Goya's black paintings. Well, meanwhile, back in France, neoclassicism lived on in David's most famous student, Ingres. That's how it's pronounced in French. This canvas is nearly 17 feet long, by the way, so it was a truly monumental work intended to awe and impress visitors to the French Salon where it was submitted. Like Raphael's School of Athens, on which it's clearly based, Ingres' painting is a sacra conversazione. You remember what that is? It's a kind of fake conversation between figures who actually lived at different times. Unlike Raphael, Ingres includes artists and literary figures. So who's crowning Homer, by the way? It's our old friend Winged Victory, or Nike. And the two women sitting below him are actually personifications of his most famous works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Some kind person labeled this for me. You see the full cast of characters. I confess I did not do that. I borrowed it. I find this a much more interesting painting. It also shows that Romanticism was infecting even a die-hard neoclassicist like Ingres. By the way, he returned more strongly to neoclassicism when he got a lot of grief for this particular painting, as you will know if you listen to the Khan Academy podcast. I've already mentioned Orientalism, the fascination with the exotic Near East. That's characteristic of a lot of Romantic art, this fascination with the exotic. And you can also in this painting see Ingres' debt to his hero, Raphael. Look at her face. And look at this sort of unnaturally elongated figure. There are actually too many vertebrae in the back. That shows a debt to mannerists such as Pontormo. You remember the lady with the long neck? But note, and this will become important in a couple of lectures when we get to Monet, that Ingres uses the exotic setting much as Renaissance painters used mythological settings. It gave their nude paintings a cloak of respectability. It established a distance from the viewer. These weren't real women. These were goddesses. Or in this case, these were harem chicks. And that's all going to change very soon, so stay tuned. So I've mentioned Romanticism's fascination with the horrible, the demonic, the nightmarish. The mare in Nightmare, by the way, has nothing to do with the horse. It's a reference to Mara, a spirit in northern mythology who was thought to torment and suffocate sleepers. Note that for all its bizarre subject, the painting actually has a lot of naturalistic details. And in its lighting and sense of drama, it really evokes the Baroque, an era that many Romantic painters consciously copied. But the subject matter is quite different. We're pretty much done with altarpieces. Which is not to say that we are done with religious themes. Many Romantic thinkers called for a return to religious faith, and especially mystical, visionary, emotional faith. Remember that they were particularly attracted to the Middle Ages. We'll see more of that when we look at architecture in the next lecture. So the English painter and poet William Blake, he actually despised organized religion. He kind of came up with his own religion, which was an amalgam of a lot of different mystical views and some, borrowings from Buddhism and Hinduism. But he deeply admired the Bible, and he saw Jesus as a vital link between God and man. So here you see some of his illustrations from sort of personal work, a book of worship, inspired by the Bible, by his own dreams, and by a highly personal mysticism. I find the highly stylized rhythm of Ancient of Days fascinating. It seems like a much more recent work than 1794. I think it has a very modern feel to it, kind of Art Deco, if you will. Well, I'm going to end today's lecture with the two French painters who more than any other have really come to define Romanticism, although I personally kind of prefer Goya, as you've gathered. So these two painters are Théodore Géricault and Eugene Delacroix. Now, the main thing I'm going to say about this very famous painting, The Raft of the Medusa, is I didn't actually go back and count, but I think there are more questions on this work on your Unit 11 test than on any other work from this unit. It shows up a lot on AP exams. Well, beyond that, I actually don't have a lot to add to the excellent Khan Academy podcast, to your textbook's very thorough discussion of this work, and to the video clip you're about to see, which also discusses Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. In fact, if you are feeling like watching art history videos, it's from a Portrait of a Masterpiece documentary on Liberty Leading the People. So, what are you going to need to know? You're going to need to know the story behind this painting, the political context, and by the way, there's more than one political message here. Take a note at the fellow on top who's African. I mentioned the underlying political messages, the studies Géricault made before he painted it, the compositional style, what earlier periods and artists influenced Géricault, the role that nature plays in this and other romantic paintings. So if you watched the excellent Khan Academy podcast on this work, if you didn't, well, you should, and I'd recommend rewatching it before the test. Now, the video makes this point as well, but note the compositional pyramids, very common in Romantic as well as Baroque painting. Géricault also employs a very open composition. Remember what that means? The painting is spilling out of its canvas into our space. Note that this puts us among the corpses. And the same thing is true in Liberty Leading the People. It's a very deliberate. We're to sort of to identify with the dead. We are among the masses. Remember that the Romantics were rebelling against Enlightenment and neoclassic rationalism. They were especially fascinated by dreams, especially nightmares. So it's little wonder that Géricault, who was a very avid student of anatomy and of psychology, would become interested in the phenomenon of insanity. Just as he had traveled to morgues to study corpses in preparation for painting The Raft of the Medusa, he also visited institutions for the criminally insane. Note that the romantic theme of madness of the macabre, the sublime, is combined with great naturalism and psychological insight. Actually, we see touches of realism, which we will encounter in the lecture after next. So in the ongoing battle between line and color, between Poussin and Rubens, which side do you think Delacroix took? Well, Ingres, whom we just saw, inherited the mantle of Poussin, and Delacroix became the great defender of color. Now, the influence of Rubens should be especially clear in this painting. You note the voluptuous nudes, the carefully modeled figures, the vibrant colors, and of course the pyramidal composition. But the story, and this is a very important romantic element, comes from contemporary literature. Specifically, it comes from a poem by the great romantic poet Lord Byron. The setting is the ever-popular exotic Near East. As the story goes, an Assyrian king has learned that his armies have been defeated, so he's on his funeral pyre, which will be lit soon, and meanwhile he's watching while his guards kill off his women, his slaves, and his horses. And here we see the fascination with Orientalism applied to another contemporary tragedy. In 1822, the inhabitants of the Greek island of Chios tried to join the Greek War of Independence, which was going on at the time and would eventually be successful. Ottoman Turks, who still controlled Greece, invaded the island and killed or enslaved tens of thousands of islanders. This got a lot of press back in England, France, where years of classical education had given people a strong sense of tie to Greece, plus you have people fighting for freedom, plus you have an exotic locale, plus Byron died fighting for Greece. These are all ingredients for a romantic subject. So for a moment, I'm skipping over Delacroix's most famous work. I'm going to end with that, to show you paintings he made after a visit to North Africa in 1832. Earlier, he had mostly painted the struggle between humans. But after this visit, he increasingly turned to images of combat between nature and man or between animals. Note the very vibrant use of color. Delacroix was actually a student of the science of color. He was also very interested, as we'll see in the next set of lectures, in photography. So these paintings are a feast of vivid contrasting colors and deep color values. We'll see more of that when we get to the Impressionists. Okay, this is the work that made Delacroix famous, and it's perhaps the most iconic of all French paintings. The occasion, as you saw in the video clip, was the Revolution of 1830. That, by the way, is the revolution described in Les Miserables, which many of you may know. So this revolution succeeded in bringing down the French monarchy, at least the Bourbon monarchy, and bringing in a more liberal and bourgeois branch of the French royal family in the form of King Louis Philippe. But this new regime was not quite liberal enough to stomach such a revolutionary painting. It was basically returned to Delacroix. It would be decades before the revolution would become sufficiently old news, and this figure, now dubbed Marianne, would become the symbol of France. I'm going to continue with Romanticism in my next lecture, and I'm going to talk about my second favorite painter after Caravaggio, the British painter James Millard William Turner. By the way, the College Board likes him too. His painting, The Slave Ship, is probably the source of the second largest number of questions on your test. So stay tuned and watch that Khan Academy podcast, okay?